Hello and welcome to the Steven Greenfields and Toros Investments webinar on ESG in mining. I'm Steven Greenfields, an entrepreneurial corporate lawyer with a keen interest in natural resources and a passion for sustainability. I'm CEO at international law firm Steven Greenfields and a director at Toros Investments.
And I'm Nick Rix-Perez. I'm currently at the University of Oxford and I'm collaborating with Steven Greenfields on their internship program.
Also joining us will be experts from the world of asset management. Lucinda Downing, Portfolio Manager at Aon, and from the world of industrial services. Rachel O'Donnell, UK and Ireland Head of Environmental and Energy at ECOM. So to bring this into focus, firstly, what is ESG? As I'm sure we all know, ESG is an acronym for Environmental, Social and Governance. In business, these three pillars constitute a framework of non-financial performance criteria used to evaluate the sustainability and ethics of an activity. They provide both principles to live by and metrics to measure with. There are many different definitions of each criterion. For simplicity, we have defined these as follows. Environmental relates to an activity's dependence and impact on the natural world. Social relates to an activity's engagement with and effect on people. Governance is the system by which an activity is directed and controlled. So how does ESG relate to, and why does it matter to, the mining industry? From an ethical perspective, in recent years, we have seen ESG rapidly shift from best practice through standard practice to minimum standards, as people are becoming increasingly aware of the need to engage in more ethical and sustainable behavior. ESG is no longer the moral high ground, it is the ticket to the game. In business, many studies have shown that ESG conscious companies perform better and enjoy more sustainable value creation. Last year, it was recorded that 90% of the S&P 500 companies published an annual ESG report. Consequently, investors are increasingly looking to ESG companies to gain better returns on their investments with less risk. Looking backwards, sustainable investing grew by 10 times in the last 15 years. Currently, ESG companies represent $20 trillion assets under management. That's 25% of the global total. In the future, this is expected to increase substantially, doubling in less than 20 years. Nowadays, if a business is not ESG optimized, then it risks losing investors, customers, and staff, as well as litigation, negative PR, and maybe boycotts of products and services or other protests. It goes without saying that everyone wants to be more ESG. But given the relative novelty of the concept and the amount of noise surrounding the subject, we appreciate that it is not always entirely clear how to do this. What is clear is that the mining industry holds some of the biggest ESG opportunities. This is why we've prepared this talk in an attempt to highlight the benefits of ESG and propose ways in which mining companies can tackle the challenges and make the most of ESG opportunities. The universal starting point for ESG is the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals of 2015. Not all of the SDGs are directly relevant to mining companies, and many apply to the same areas of mining activities. After considering each of the 17 SDGs, we have identified 8 areas listed on the slide where they are most applicable to the mining industry. These 8 areas form the outline of our talk. Although they overlap and interplay, for the sake of simplicity, we have grouped them under environmental, social, and governance, as shown on the slide. So first, let's have a look at the main environmental considerations for miners: waste management, conservation and restoration, and climate change. Before we start on waste management, we should note that waste management can account for as much as 1/3 of the energy consumption at a mine. So this is something that must be considered in the context of climate change also. Now, mining, as we all know, produces a lot of waste. And this can be released into the environment if not properly handled and cause grave ecological problems. In particular, this waste can pollute and contaminate natural habitats, water supplies, and food sources. Unfortunately, previous ecological damage has already resulted in a negative stigma surrounding mining, which means, for example, that miners have yet to qualify for B Corp status. The aim, therefore, has got to be to minimize the environmental degradation caused by pollution and contamination as a result of improper waste disposal. The volume of waste from mining operations can be extremely high and so difficult to manage. There is a three-step approach to reduce this volume of waste: in recovery, reuse, and recycling. And engineers have developed practical ways of recycling this waste. There are three examples. Overburden, the material that lies above the exploited land, can be used for contouring land and for constructing buildings and roads. Mine tailings, or waste, can become economic for additional mineral extraction or can be reprocessed for producing clay, glass, and concrete. Mine water, which is the surface water that enters mining excavations and undergoes physiochemical changes, can be treated and then reused in dust and particulate suppression, as well as acting as a coolant. Secondly, adverse mining effects on the environment are extremely varied and depend on the nature of the contaminant or pollutant. Thus, it can be difficult to tackle all possible ecological ramifications, especially since many only become apparent after a long period of time. A general ecologically conscious waste management policy consisting of three pillars: 1, education; 2, planning and monitoring; and 3, regulation, provides an opportunity to combat the majority of these adverse environmental effects. Education on relevant sustainable practice at all levels is necessary for fostering a culture of environmental consciousness. This needs to come from the top. Planning and monitoring enables mining corporations to preempt and avoid environmental degradation, rather than having to solve ecological crises when they arise. This requires high-level leadership, brainstorming with relevant experts at the outset, and monitoring reliably and routinely on an ongoing basis. This will help to avoid fines, cleanup costs, and reputational fallout. Good regulation can also be used to set, monitor, and enforce appropriate minimum standards. Now, over to Nick to talk to us about conservation and restoration.
Thank you, Stephen. So moving on now to conservation and restoration. So the main challenge here is that mining by nature is a rather disruptive industry, and establishing a mine in a natural area often disrupts or can even destroy ecosystems, thereby drastically reducing biodiversity. So about 44% of mines are located in forests, and mining overall contributes to 7% of global deforestation. Now, this is problematic for many reasons, not least because extinction and deforestation are directly linked to climate change, which we'll hear more about in a second. Now, so the aim here really is to minimize the disruption caused by a mine insofar as is practically possible. And once the mine ceases to be operational, the site should be ideally restored to its original natural state. Now, so the first obstacle here is, as aforementioned, there's inevitably going to be an impact to the natural world, because while land needs to be dug up, noise is going to be created and trees are going to be cut down. And so the solution here really is to minimize and localize the impact as much as possible by adhering to the following general stages throughout the mining life cycle. So firstly, before beginning the project, it's really important to seek permission to operate on the site, and to ensure that it doesn't have any sort of protected status. It's also really important to familiarize oneself with the local ecosystem. And then, so during the actual mining project's life, the tight waste management we've just heard from Stephen will go a really long way to limiting the biodiversity loss. But secondly, it's also important during the project to remain localized, which basically means remaining within the mining lease. Now, a study by the scientific journal Nature in 2017 concluded that deforestation around mining leases is 12 times more prevalent than within, and personnel often engage in disruptive leisure activities off-site, such as hunting. And both of these sort of expansion and disruptive hobbies ought to be heavily discouraged and or penalised. Now, if lease expansion is desired or required, then this must be officially agreed with relevant authorities and stakeholders. And then finally, during the post-production phase, so at the end of the mine's life, now either once the project ends, the site should ideally be restored to its original natural state. And it's important to note that the restoration process, including the feasibility and the financing arrangements, should be arranged before the project begins. Or alternatively, if the mine site and the surrounding infrastructure have been upcycled or repurposed into a permanent complex, the company could contribute to the creation or maintenance of an equivalent ecosystem elsewhere. Now, this latter option isn't ideal, but should satisfy ESG criteria, so long as net conservation is not negative. So that's the first obstacle and the proposed solution. And the second obstacle is that, well, actually a lot of the industry's deforestation and destruction is performed by smaller cap sort of artisanal mines, which are a lot more difficult to regulate. And the World Bank in 2012 found that they are to be found in at least 2/3 of the world's so-called protected forests. And so the solution we propose here really is that we ask that larger cap companies lead the way and take the initiative. And this is for three reasons mainly. Well, firstly, this might establish a precedent in the industry which could foster more responsible behavior in the smaller companies. Secondly, larger companies might, by virtue of having more capital, might be able to pioneer or provide effectively a conservation blueprint for artisanal mines to then use. And thirdly, if larger companies are acting more responsibly, then the regulatory agencies can direct their efforts towards smaller companies without being distracted by the larger fish. Now, once again, it's being proactive here is really vital because ecosystems are incredibly fragile and extinction is, or at least at present, an irreversible process. So it's very difficult, if not impossible, to rebuild these ecosystems once they are gone.
So now we turn to Rachel to talk us through climate change.
Thank you, Stephen. Turning now to climate change. The challenge here is that mining operations require considerable amounts of energy. Currently, most of this energy is sourced from carbon-based energy stores, so large quantities of greenhouse gases are emitted, which contributes significantly to climate change. So the aim is for mining companies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero. The only way this can be done pragmatically and sustainably is by decarbonising the operation's energy supply. As 75 to 80% of mining's carbon footprint is in the smelting process, this means replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy. The first obstacle is that mining requires a lot of energy. It's feared that alternative energies will not be able to meet demand or provide a consistent baseload. The response to this concern is that renewable energy already provides 1/3 of the world's electricity, so renewable energy is able to supply a large portion of required energy. Unfortunately, it's becoming increasingly efficient and widespread. If mines cannot use renewables exclusively with decarbonisation, they ought to increase the share insofar as is pragmatic, i.e. carbon reduction. This means that using clean energy where viable, for example, electric vehicles. An example of a mine using renewable energy is Anglo American in Chile, where 256 photovoltaic panels have been installed in a tailings pond, providing 86 kilowatts. Second obstacle is that there's no universal renewable energy source, and certain remote regions struggle more than others to decarbonise. The solution here lies in the great variety of renewable energy sources: solar, hydro, tidal, geothermal, nuclear, wind, local grid, hydrogen fuel, biofuel and batteries. It's highly likely that some renewable energy supplies will be applicable. Each mine should use the most appropriate sources of renewable energies for that region. The third major obstacle is that renewable energy sources are currently more expensive than conventional carbon-based sources. This affects smaller cap mining companies in particular, as they might lack the upfront capital to invest in renewable ventures. As a response to this, firstly, it's important to bear in mind that green energy is becoming cheaper all the time. Secondly, decarbonisation is cheaper if factored into mine design rather than being bolted on later as an afterthought. Thirdly, it is possible that governments as UN members and ESG conscious investors will help raise the necessary green capital. As Stephen mentioned earlier, a lot of money is flowing into ESG. And this will be easier if the sustainable energy is connected to the local population. Fourthly, it seems unlikely that green energy will be more expensive than carbon for long. Money has been moving away from fossil fuels and into renewables. This trend will continue post-Paris and post-Biden, so expect further fossil fuel taxation and for carbon subsidies to dry up. It's best not to risk creating stranded assets now. Finally, if another financial incentive to decarbonise is necessary, climate change litigation is heating up. For example, in 2019, Client Earth and Enia went to court and a €1.2 billion 1 gigawatt coal plant was blocked. Just one landmark case acting as a precedent and the floodgates open. So even if it is costly to go green in the short term, in the long term, green companies will avoid costlier lawsuits. Ultimately, net zero is an aspirational target, not a prescribed blueprint. So if the mining project itself cannot be net zero, the company should strive for net zero effects through other contributions, for example, planting trees, carbon capturing. Just take care here, as greenwashing is insufficient and very low hanging fruit in climate change litigation. Companies must therefore fully embrace the net zero goal and take the initiative, jumping before they are pushed, because the window of opportunity for effective action is closing. Back to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Rachel. So now to look at social considerations in mining and how mining affects people. We've broken this down into two spheres. Firstly, the community within the mine, its people, their rights, and their welfare. And secondly, the local community surrounding the mine and the local economy. So let's look at the people within the project itself. Mines by nature are hazardous, high-pressure environments that pose a serious threat to employees' safety, health, and psychology, and even their lives. For example, in 2019, the Vale mining disaster in Brazil resulted in 259 deaths. Additionally, in the mining industry, employees have historically faced a number of employment-related hurdles without adequate representation, including lower pay, job instability, and inequality issues. This can impact productivity and relations. The aim, therefore, has got to be to encourage good working conditions and promote well-being for all employees. The ultimate goals must therefore be, firstly, zero harm to personnel, and secondly, sustained, inclusive, healthy, and productive employment for all. A mine poses various physical health risks that are often serious. In addition to the ever-present possibility of fire, flood, explosion, and collapse, workers are exposed to increased occupational health risks, such as accidents, cardiovascular and respiratory diseases from dust, conditions caused by noise, vibration, or harmful chemicals, and possibly local diseases. An understanding of the environment is the first step in preventing illness or injury in the workplace. The second step is to ensure adequate health and safety measures are in place. This has got to become standard operating procedure, taught to all and rigidly enforced. These might include, for example, a dust control plan, vibration dampeners, noise reduction panels, appropriate safety equipment, procedures, and other precautions to minimize exposure to harmful chemicals, hygiene, and pest control. There are also increasing reports of mental health issues in workers. Psychological problems can arise for a variety of reasons. For example, long hours and extended periods of time living away from home and family, tough working conditions, a male-dominated workforce, which can create a machoistic culture where people are less likely to seek help, or gender inequality, marginalization of female workers. There can also be social tensions between the workers for whatever reason. It should also be noted that mental health issues can increase the risk of safety incidents at work with potentially fatal consequences. For mental health, the solution is to establish a healthy culture with welfare mechanisms in place to ensure employees are both able and willing to seek welfare if and when required. For example, in 2015, BHP implemented a new mental health framework to ensure that there was awareness, support, and proactive management of mental health issues across the company. It introduced 4 key focus areas of culture, capacity, prevention, and recovery. and there is already reported evidence which suggests that employees are more engaged in mental health, more likely to disclose issues, and there is increased participation in early intervention. Good mental health can also be fostered via communal projects. For example, providing suitable accommodation and leisure facilities, and this can be particularly important in remote locations. In terms of employment, there's often a noticeable power imbalance between mining corporations and their workers. In the mining industry, there is a monopsony market. This is where there is only one single buyer. In effect, the mining corporation may be the only employer in the region. As a result, corporations can assert considerable influence over workers who are competing for limited jobs. Consequently, these companies are often able to set lower wages and avoid making promises about job security. However, this is not likely to be successful or productive in the long term. By offering favorable and competitive terms to employees, this will bring out the best in the workforce, enhance the reputation of the mining company, and spread goodwill throughout the local community. To maintain this harmony, the company can then establish or collaborate with the representative bodies, enabling the workers' voices to be heard. All of these steps can improve the well-being and consequently the productivity of the workers. Now I'll hand over to Nick to talk through the wider community.
Thank you, Stephen. So turning now to the social impact of the mine beyond the mine site and the immediate personnel to the local community and the economy. It's also worth noting that before I begin that the earlier environmental concerns and some of the health, safety and economic concerns Stephen just raised should also be considered in the context of the wider local community. And so with regard to the local community and the economy, the main challenge here is that the arrival of a mining project can raise significant concerns about the impact on the local community. And such concerns are well-founded and are accentuated particularly when locals don't experience, or even worse, are actively harmed by the financial benefits or effects of the mine-induced boost. And so the aim here really is to secure the social license to operate, abbreviated as the SLO, by demonstrating that and how the mine will be beneficial for locals, holistically and sustainably. Now, the SLO is desirable because, well, firstly, it's an opportunity to win over people's hearts. And secondly, from an operational perspective, from 2008 to 2015, only 30% of precious metal projects were delivered on time. And the reason for delay in 42% of instances was because of social opposition. Therefore, gaining the SLO should be very important from just purely a practical perspective. So the first obstacle here really is that there are often a variety of stakeholders, which means that there are conflicting interests almost by default. A textbook example of this would be between a mining company and an indigenous community concerned about the land. And so the solution here is really just to, in order to resolve these tensions, to engage in fair negotiations with local stakeholders via community development agreements, or CDAs. Now, if this consenting process is not adhered to properly, it can lead to serious opposition, which is subsequently incredibly difficult to dispel, as Rio Tinto is currently experiencing following the incident with the Aboriginal caves in Australia in May of 2020. Now, so the second obstacle is the fact that, or the second obstacle to working with the locals is that the locals themselves might be unskilled, and therefore there is an understandable inclination to import more skilled foreign labour. However, this is incredibly damaging, as an influx of foreign workers can firstly rapidly change the texture of the local area and therefore provoke sort of social backlash. And secondly, it can also drive up living costs for locals, and which is particularly damaging if their general livelihoods have also been affected by the arrival of the mine. So the solution here really is to perhaps strongly encourage to enact a policy of local first, which entails hiring, educating, and training locals into the workforce, because involving people effectively wins them over. And mining companies in Arizona are currently having great success doing this with the Navajo locals. Now, it's also really important in the hiring process to ensure that opportunities are being created for women, because a study in 2015 on Africa showed that mine openings have a long-term tendency of pushing local women out of the labour force. But however, fortunately, a separate study in 2017 found that if this is managed correctly, the arrival of a mining project can actually increase female employment by around 30%, which is obviously a desirable goal in itself and forms the 5th UN Sustainable Development Goal. Okay, so moving on to the third obstacle now, is the fact that, okay, well, many of these health and social issues only become apparent after many years in hindsight and because of cumulative exposure. And so the solution here really is just effectively preemptive monitoring. Well, firstly, ideally, most major health issues shouldn't arise if waste management and employee welfare are properly conducted. But just in case, it's important for the mining companies to monitor local health and other social indicators such as education and poverty levels, and as well as giving a sort of sufficient foresight and control over any potentially arising issues. The infrastructure used for this process, such as health clinics, could then actively benefit the community in other ways rather than simply not harming them. Now, moving on to the fourth obstacle, which is actually, well, the main reason many of the economic fruits brought by a mine are often not seen by locals is not the mining company itself, but rather the shortcomings of local governments in sort of distributing the revenue. And of course, there's a limit to the extent to which a mining company can adopt these responsibilities without overstepping into government jurisdiction. And so the solution here, perhaps to effectively bypass this problem, well, mining companies can proceed to promote community development projects, or CDPs. And effectively, infrastructure and providing other services can be totally transformative, extending far beyond the life of the mining project and permitting sustainable economic growth. So an example of this would be connecting the mine's energy supply to the local town, or converting the abandoned mine shaft into a storage for the local energy grid. Now, granted, CDPs can be expensive, and the smaller companies are encouraged to dip into mineral development funds, or MDFs, to help finance these ventures. But really, the philosophy underlying all of what I've just said is effectively to tether the flourishing of the mine to the flourishing of the local community, but to do this in such a way that when the mining project ends, the community is able to autonomously develop further. So it's not just a boom-bust situation. Now, importantly, from a sort of from the company's perspective, if this is done correctly, not only should this increase productivity and ensure smooth operations, but it should actually lead to the company being given more licenses as governments then see the long-term benefits for their area.
Thank you, Nick. Now, turning to the third pillar, governance, the systems by which the project is directed and controlled. This is an area full of nebulous concepts that all sound like obvious common sense, but it's also an area of much debate with no simple one-size-fits-all solution. Accordingly, we will focus on the 3 areas where problems are most likely to arise: management, transparency, and responsibility to shareholders. Good governance starts with good management. Simply put, this means having the right people with the right skills in the right roles, doing the right things in the right way. On account of the scale and complexity of mining operations, the structure and responsibilities of a company's management might not always be as clear as they should be. This can be particularly acute when so many executives have very specific expertise and experience, usually in the case of miners in science or in finance. Given the importance of management to the strategy and overall sustainable success of a business, it's essential for companies to establish effective, representative, and accountable management. Sometimes mining boards can be highly homogeneous, consisting of a single demographic, which, in addition to restricting the expertise and experience present in the boardroom, may not reflect the full diversity of the company's workforce or other stakeholders. In my experience, out of hundreds of mining companies that I've met, I've only met one female CEO, and I'm only aware of a handful of female directors on other boards. There are also many close teams who've stayed together for most of their careers, and there are not many on boards who are not either geologists or bankers. On the more positive side, however, there do seem to be an increasing number of mining boards welcoming local executives and experts. The more diversified a board is, the more skills, expertise, and experience can be brought to the decision-making process. This then creates wider debate among a more representative team. Given the global scale of operations across time zones, geographic regions, cultures and languages, as well as competing work streams and priorities, the board can easily become disconnected from the mine and the people on the ground. Conversely, if the board are all on site, the company can become disconnected from investors and other partners. The executives need to be and remain sufficiently plugged in to all aspects of the business, as well as the breadth of skills and experience afforded by a diverse board. The time and resources need to be managed proportionally and the needs of the company as a whole monitored on an ongoing basis. This needs clear structure, reporting, and communications. Now I'll pass you to Nick to talk us through transparency.
Brilliant, thank you, Stephen. And so the main issue here, so the main challenge regarding transparency is that mining companies have historically failed to be sufficiently transparent in their governance structures and operations. This makes it quite difficult to dispel suspicions about corruption and illegal activity. And in an increasingly ESG sensitive world, opacity is reasonable cause for suspicion, and this will spook investors, unsettle stakeholders, and invite litigation. So the aim here really is to overcome this historical reputation and build a new, very good reputation, which earns the trust of investors, the stakeholders, the public, and the courtrooms, so that mining companies can proceed to demonstrate their virtues and their value, rather than constantly being on the back foot defending missteps or accusations of wrongdoing. Now, it's also the case that clear, transparent practices and systems, this should facilitate operational stability and success, and contribute to good management, which we've just heard from Stephen. Now, effectively, all of this ought to be aligned with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative of 2003. Now, so what are the obstacles here? Well, the first obstacle here is that mining companies are almost always involved in very large, complex, far-reaching networks in which there are many actors, and both within the company and sort of in external third parties. And so it can be difficult to sort of really know what's going on, who's doing what, and who's basically involved. So the solution here is twofold. Firstly, it's important to ensure internal, structural, and procedural transparency. Now, good management, just mentioned by Stephen, will take care of the majority of this step, especially in fostering a culture of compliance and openness. But secondly, it's also important to implement clear procedural control systems, and which will in turn also facilitate risk management. Now, secondly, once the house is in order, it's important to check who you're getting into bed with, and so basically to look externally. Now, this is important effectively in knowing and disclosing the supply chain or any third-party contractors. And this is becoming increasingly important as corporations are increasingly being held accountable for their third-party relationships, even if they're in foreign jurisdictions, in sort of new legislation in the UK, the United States of America, the European Union, and in Canada. Okay, so that's the first obstacle. And then the second obstacle is, well, actually the scale and complexity of operations undertaken by mining companies themselves means that it's often difficult to monitor them, and thus to know sort of which activities to report and effectively how to report them. So the solution here is basically to at least strive for maximal disclosure via sort of annual ESG reports. Now we suggest establishing monitoring bodies and implementing a regular ESG reporting framework. And we heard earlier that as of July of 2020, 90% of the S&P 500 companies are already publishing an annual ESG report. So there's plenty of precedent in the corporate world for this. It's also worth noting that so establishing monitoring bodies and independent and sort of regular ESG reporters is great, and they can be afforded more credibility if the monitoring or reporting body is sort of independent from government and the mining companies to a certain extent. Now, effectively, this just amounts to tracking and disclosing your actions and consequences honestly. And all of this transparency should help to earn a good reputation of accountability, correct behavior, and risk management.
Thank you, Nick. Now we'll hand over to Lucinda to wrap up governance with the shareholder perspective.
Thank you, Stephen. I work for an investment consultancy that works with pension fund clients and the broader investment industry on initiatives to move the ESG course forward. I'm not providing any investment advice here, but I wanted to add a few words on the topic of corporate governance and particularly the responsibility companies have towards their shareholders. The key challenge here is that sometimes, and it may just be due to a lack of transparency or communication, shareholders might suspect that the interests of executives are not entirely aligned with their own. This disconnect between ownership and control often leads to mistrust, tension, and consequently poorer business outcomes. The aim is to align executives and shareholders and to develop a culture of trust and legitimacy in the boardroom. Shareholders should feel emotionally and ethically invested and not just financially so. Even in times of crisis, confidence and faith and indeed loyalty in the company's leadership will lead to investor retention. Now on to two particular obstacles that often present themselves. Firstly, unclear ownership. Unclear or even anonymous ownership, which is particularly prevalent in small companies or certain regions, leads to suspicion by investors and complicated global supply chains. This can deter investors from holding shares in a company and may lead to blacklisting from ESG conscious portfolios. The solution is to publicize the beneficial ownership of the company in accordance with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or EITI for short. It's also worth ensuring reliable proxy access so that shareholders feel that they can properly participate in the company's decision-making processes. A second obstacle I wanted to also mention is the rather thorny issue of executive bonuses. Excessively large bonuses for executives, money that might otherwise be reinvested in a company's future, can incense shareholders, and especially so during periods of downturn. Factoring ESG into executive remuneration is a good way to align executives with the best interests of the company and therefore shareholders. This is becoming increasingly common practice, and in fact 45% of FTSE 100 companies link their pay to ESG measures based on 2020 annual reports. A widely reported example of this is the occasion when BHP's CEO took a 25% pay cut in 2019 due to a mine fatality. This is obviously a very sad situation, but really great evidence of how seriously a company takes its ESG goals in pursuit of sustainable success. Back to you, Steven.
Thank you, Lucinda. So in conclusion, we'll have a look at the benefits of ESG awareness. There are numerous benefits arising from ESG awareness, which we summarize with the following helpful acronym: FOREST. F for financial. Good ESG brings increased profits and investment. In a recent PwC report, they found that 65% of investors consider ESG for risk-adjusted returns. O for operational. Good ESG minimizes risk and helps the company to operate more effectively and efficiently. It will also make it less likely to have legal and regulatory issues. R for reputational. Good ESG practice will lower risk of ecological disasters, negative PR campaigns and lawsuits, boost the company's relationships internally and externally, and its general reputation. E for ethical. ESG principles ensure operation in an ethical manner, which also increases the attractiveness of the product to principle-driven customers and other stakeholders. S for sustainability. ESG criteria fuel sustainable operation, meaning that a business can run without compromising future abilities and opportunities. And lastly, T for trust. Strong ESG leadership will boost the trust that investors, staff, partners, and customers place in the business. This may be hard to quantify, but will turn all business avenues into paths of least resistance. In addition to the guidance and benefits we've just outlined, there are two key takeaways. Firstly, ESG comprises ideas and principles, not prescriptions. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, prevention is always better than cure. Thank you for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this webinar and found it useful. If you have any comments or queries, please do get in touch. My contact details are at the bottom of this last slide.